Hi everyone, welcome to this third lecture on building economics. So today we're going to look at chapter 2 of unit 1, and we're going to look at the needs of the individual and the community, as well as the needs of the developer. So within this chapter we're going to look at what is most the developments are undertaken due to a market design or market demand. So each development, there's a certain amount of demand for a development. So it really depends on the demand for a specific building. One will not go and build a new building if there's no need for it. For instance, you won't go and build a community center, for instance, in a small community where water and electricity is not available and is a bigger need than really anything else. So it really depends on the market and what can be provided. So there's either a direct demand for housing, offices or so, or there can be an indirect demand which requires to fulfill a certain need. So for instance, there's an indirect need for however it is, there's always a demand, or the demand is always economical of nature, because the economy is one of the constraints that one will consider. So someone must be willing to pay for the actual development. Someone has to be remunerated for their efforts of actually doing the construction. So the client or the individual company will be building for a direct profit. What income will he receive from the development, or how many units will be required? So the developer firstly has to obtain land before he can actually do a development. So it's very important that certain items are in place before a development can actually start, and the planning for that development can start, because the land will is also one of the constraints, and the location is also one of the constraints that one usually considers when you do any development. Okay, so the development cost, building development, the total expenditure of a development will be higher than the net cost of the building. So usually there's some profit that's added to any construction. Someone has to not just pay for what it will cost to actually construct this building, but they will have to get more than actually just that, because they have to pay salaries, they have to make a profit, a salary for themselves, and so forth. So these costs could comprise the cost of land, okay, the legal cost, demolitions of existing buildings, the building cost itself, professional fees. So it's not just the actual building cost that we consider. There's a whole lot of other cost that is considered as well, where land, legal costs, maybe demolition cost, and the building itself, and then also professional fees, the architect that's doing the design, the engineer that does the design for the water pipeline installation. Also, it's all factors that contribute to the cost of a construction project. Okay, so the development costs continue. These costs could comprise also includes items like fittings, machinery, marketing. If you're selling houses, for instance, a new development, a new security village, or so, someone will have to buy them. So marketing is very important for that. And then obviously one has to pay VAT for the development. There's certain taxes that has to be paid as well. For instance, if you're occupying a new house, it's not just the actual construction cost of the house. You will have to pay taxes for the land that you acquired, services that you have to pay for, etc., etc. You will have cost for financing, the interest rate, and then you will have the life cycle cost, which I mentioned earlier, which might include the taxes, the water, the just the upkeep of the new building that you're going to build. So building cost is only a portion of the total cost. So one will have to see the package as a whole whenever we're looking at a new development. So that's very important to take note of. Okay, so the cost targets and motivation for development. So there's a couple. So there's a difference between the public and private sectors of the economy, as well as between the economical viable buildings and buildings that are not. So private developments are not always aimed at making a profit. Charitable purposes or some of the partially self-supported motivations are also part of this. So private developments can be just to fulfill a needs, like for instance building a church. It's not necessarily to build the church for a profit, but there's a certain need that has to be that's being fulfilled within that community. Okay, so we've got profit developments, developments looking purely at profit, and these developments, the purpose of these developments is to make a profit. There's a set target. The project has to be within this budget so that it can be sold for a higher price, so that an actual profit can be made. So calculated how much he she can afford to spend under the building cost for a project to be profitable after all these factors as mentioned above was taken into account. So whenever you start with a development, a developer will have to look at what will be the cost of land, what will be the design cost, if VAT is added to that, if services has to be paid, the upkeep of those buildings, etc., etc. The standard of the building will influence its income and rent and the flexibility. So very important is in real estate also is the location of that project. Is it located in the right place? Is it up to standard? Is the ceiling falling out or so, or is it a nice experience going to that shopping mall, for instance? And then very important, the budget must not be exceeded. When working on profit developments, the budget is extremely important because in property economics you will learn that there's a bigger picture that one has to look at, because many times the developer has many options for development and he has to choose between some of those options, and he usually opts for the one that shows the high promise of profit. And if the budget is exceeded, that budget or that planned budget profit is actually eaten into. So cost planning and cost control is very important to achieve success. And then early or late completion can play a big role in the profit. So for instance, if you think about a shopping mall is a very good example of this. If you complete late, the tenants of that shopping mall will move in later, and thus the clientele will only start going to the shopping mall and spending money later on. Whereas if you complete the project quicker, the earlier the developer will get an income from that. Also, a very big thing usually in shopping mall developments is the tenants like Pick and Pay or Checkers, or one of the anchor tenants usually has contracts with the developer because they have everything set for a certain opening date, and as you will see later on with the social development, that it's also a thing that they have certain things that they have to have in place. Without going into too much, they have to get the stock that has to go in. Those stock is there's contracts with the suppliers of that stock. The personnel has to be appointed beforehand, so there's some recruiting that has to take place before that. So yeah, you can see there's a lot dependent on actually meeting a certain date as agreed upon with the developer. In the early stages of considering alternatives, so that's what I mentioned. So in the early stages of the project, when the design is being done and so on, the developer compares the probable return with the probable cost to see which project would be more important for him to prioritize. So, and then we get to our other section of the development, or the motivation for developments, is the social development. The main objective is not profit and the provision of buildings. It's all about the need, fulfilling the need of a community. So it's about affordability of the project, and it's not as such for making a profit, but rather a question of, can this be afforded by the responsible council, government, state, or whoever is responsible for that, addressing that need, and can the money be raised? So this can either be for instance, the church example again, or it can be the example of a town hall that has to be built. Who takes responsibility for that? Who's raising the money for that? Or it can be water infrastructure that has to be built, a new reservoir that has to be built, a sewage connection, all the services that's usually needed for that development. Okay, so it usually applied to public developments. How much money is allocated by the national budget on schools, for instance, etc., etc. And I'll elaborate a little bit about this in a short while. For a reasonable cost estimate, set artificial limits based on the cost of similar buildings in the same province. So usually when we do the cost estimations for this, it has to be a realistic cost. One has to try and be as economical as possible. It's compared to similar developments of similar nature, etc. So the unit cost for whenever we looking at these type of developments is always checked against what is the cost per pupil when you're doing this development. The stadium, the number of seats, how much is the total cost against the seats that's going to be built, the stadium. Does it compare with other stadiums that's been built previously? And then you've got a hospital, the number of beds. If you compare it to another hospital that was built, will it compare to that cost? So certain cost targets determined by the artificial standards, very little validity in the real world outside. Yes, even though that is said, one still has to be realistic, because funds are not unlimited. So and there's many needs. So in the government situation, one will weigh up the cost of for instance, if there's a need of 200 schools, but there's only budget available for 100 schools, how do you allocate those funds? If the funds can be spent better on that 100 schools, maybe 1 or 2 extra schools can be built. So yes, that is the rationale behind social development. And then also lastly, unrealistic cost rules leads to bad design. So what this can entail, this can go either way. So if you want to try and save too much money, you will have problems with the quality of the construction. If you have too much money allocated to a project, it will take away from the 100 schools, and instead of the 100 schools that you can build with the available money, now you can only build 90 schools, for instance. So that is the rationale behind the unrealistic cost rules, and leads to bad designs. And hence the Department of Public Works has certain standards that they try and keep the developments up to standard. They have standard rules of how a school building, or the standards that a school building has to adhere to. So these are standards that is applied throughout all of their developments, and has the effect that most schools will have a certain cost allocated to at least the building cost installations. Okay, so private development, for example, private houses, offices, office buildings for occupation by business itself. So, for instance, private houses is an example of this. Office buildings for businesses, and then it incorporates features of both profit and social development. So, private developments can either be social and profit driven. A good example of this is private hospitals, where there's a social need for it, but also there's a profit margin that has to be adhered to, because this is now self-funded by a certain group or so, and they have to be able to build that the hospital within that certain budget for them to actually make a profit, so that they can actually pay everyone that's going to work there, and also to be able to fulfill another need that might be there. Okay, so looking at the developers' needs a little bit more in depth, is it's developed to overcome some difficulties and justify spending of money on public projects. So you have to quantify all factors, including various social benefits and disadvantages. So for instance, you've got traffic and airport schemes and hospitals, etc., that one has to look at. Okay, so a good example of this is maybe a development within a city or town or so. It could be applied to the proposal to remove sharp curves, or to restrict the speed of intercity railways. This is putting in speed humps or so within a city. The cost of the work could be set against the savings of fuel and water, wear and tear on equipment caused by braking and acceleration, and this may not be a sufficient reason to justify the cost. However, removing the curves might save 2 minutes in traveling time, each on a 1 million passenger journey over a year. 50,000 man hours can be saved, and might just be justifiable in the relationship to the economy. Okay, so what this basically means is, if you consider this, one looks at a city development, for instance. If your city is more attractive to other, compared to another town or so, people will come there, or will be more willing to come there and be more efficient to do business in that area, and will thus spend their money or come to that city and be more efficient. It will stimulate the economy, for instance, so the local government will have more money to actually invest back into the community. So that is the ripple effect, or the rationale that one can take. The main thing is for such a development is basically to be as effective as possible. If you've got good internet, for instance, in a city, fiber has been installed to all of the city areas, you've got free Wi-Fi or so, then one can or many possible businesses might move there because of the connectivity of there. There's no need for additional electricity, for instance. If you compare one city to the other, if the one is plagued constantly with load shedding or so, and people can't really do their work as effectively in this area, if the security of that area is not in place, there's no water, sewage, and this general services. If that is a problem in one town and the town next door doesn't have that problems, it will mean that many of the businesses will move to the town next door to actually conduct their business and being able to do their business. And this is basically in how things are looked at when looking at it from a public sector view. Okay, so for every building, the client has a certain needs. It has to be clearly defined and differentiated between more and less important needs. So the main thing is to be able to prioritize, and that's where cost budgeting is very important, so that one can actually see, okay, I need a house that I have to develop, but do I need all of the fancy installations of it? Do I need marble floors? Do I need ceramic tiles, or can it be a normal porcelain tile, or do I need porcelain tiles instead of ceramic tiles? That, for instance, what is the basic needs? So the basic needs would be, for example, to compare a low cost house in comparison with a high-end house. If the need of a house and the budget only allows for a lower cost house, the client will be necessitated to only construct that he can actually afford, but still fulfilling his basic needs. So time and cost requirements must be considered in relationship to the different contract types. So this was just a side note that was also added to this, as when you do get to construction, if you've got a turnkey type of contract, for instance, that means where someone constructs a building and you are not too involved in all of trying to get the cost as low as possible. You just ask someone, I don't care, I just want this house done. I don't want to have all the trouble of going through choosing the tiles, choosing whatever, and thus that type of contract consideration will also have an influence on the development cost. The amount, for instance, paying a consultant to assist you in actually drawing up drawings or so, or just appointing a contractor that will go out to a architect. Obviously there will be a cost percentage added to the contractor going out and doing all of that sections for you, but you don't have the extra burden of going through the design process, and it might take longer or so. So one has to consider what approach to this development, and the contract in the end that will be used will also influence the way that cost and money is spent on a project. Thanks everyone. So this was just a very high-end introduction to the development needs and so on, you're more than welcome to send me an email if you've got questions on this. So you will see it's still a lot of theory that's that we're looking at. Yeah, thanks everyone. Keep well.